She was 61 years old and down to the lining of her last coat pocket when the bank men nailed the notice to her porch post and told her she had 9 days to be gone. Her name was Adelaide Marsh, and the man who signed the foreclosure was her own late husband's business partner, Royce Calloway, who had quietly bled the family ledgers dry for 3 years while smiling at her across church pews on Sunday mornings. What she had left, after the auctioneer took the furniture and the cousins took the rumors, was $11.40 folded into a handkerchief, and a stubbornness that no one had managed to auction off with the rest of her belongings. With that $11 she did the one thing every soul in Larkspur Hollow agreed was the final proof of a woman gone soft in the head. She bought the old boarded-up train depot at the dead end of Mill Street, abandoned for 11 years since the rail line rerouted, for $9 and a handshake nobody else wanted to give. They called it a tomb of splinters. They did not know that behind its rusted ticket window, sealed inside a wall that had not been opened since the Hayes administration, something waited that would not only return to Adelaide everything that had been stolen from her, but would hand the whole forgotten town back its own buried history. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Marsh. If you have ever stood in front of something the world had given up on and felt, against all good sense, that it still had a heartbeat, tell us in the comments where that place was. Adelaide had been born in 1839 in a clapboard house at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, Missouri, when the town was still young enough that the church and the smithy were the only 2 buildings with proper glass windows. Her father, Tobias Reyes, had laid track for the very rail spur that would one day make the town matter to anyone outside its own borders, and her mother, Constance, kept the household ledgers with a precision that the men who hired her husband never knew a woman possessed, because Constance never told them. She simply made certain the family never went hungry on a railroad wage that other families squandered. It was from her mother that Adelaide learned the quiet art of accounting, of watching numbers the way some women watch the weather, sensing trouble in a column long before it announced itself, and it was from her father that she learned the discipline of the rails themselves, the iron logic of schedules and manifests, and the particular dignity of small, exact work done correctly when no one was paying attention. As a girl she would walk with him to the depot before sunrise, watching the agent receive the mail satchels and the freight bills, and something in her settled into place at the sight of it, the order of it, the sense that a town's whole life moved through that one small building the way blood moves through a single chamber of the heart. She did not know then that she would spend the bulk of her adult years far from depots and ledgers both, married instead to a gentle dreaming man named Elias Marsh, who ran a modest dry goods store and believed, with the unshakable faith of men who have never once been poor, that the world rewarded good intentions as reliably as it rewarded good arithmetic. Adelaide loved him for 31 years and corrected his books in secret for nearly as many, smoothing his optimism with her own careful caution, and between the 2 of them they raised one daughter, Hester, who married a doctor and moved to St. Louis, and buried one son, Daniel, who did not come home from the war between the states. A wound Adelaide carried the way she carried everything hard, silently and standing upright. It was Elias who first brought Royce Calloway into their lives, a charming younger man with a salesman's warmth and a memory for names that made strangers feel like old friends within the hour, and Elias, against Adelaide's quiet unease, made him a partner in the store, certain that twice the warmth meant twice the trust the town would offer them. Adelaide had said nothing against it outright, because in 31 years of marriage she had learned the particular wisdom of choosing her battles, and Elias's enthusiasms were rarely worth the cost of crushing them. But she watched Calloway the way her mother had taught her to watch a column of figures that didn't sit right, and she began, without telling her husband, to keep a private set of her own notes regarding the store's accounts, tucked inside a hat box on the highest shelf of her closet, a habit that would, many years later, prove to be either her salvation or her undoing, though at the time it felt like nothing more than an old woman's nervous comfort. The fall came slowly enough that Adelaide could almost forgive herself for not seeing the whole shape of it until it had already swallowed her. Elias died in the winter of 1893, his heart simply stopping one evening as he sat reading by the stove, and in her grief Adelaide did what grief asks of every woman who has spent her whole life being the careful one. She let go of the reins just for a season, just long enough to breathe, and she trusted Royce Calloway to manage the store and its debts while she buried her husband and tried to remember how to wake up in an empty bed. Calloway used that season generously, though not for her benefit. He took loans against the store in both their names, claiming Elias's old signatures were sufficient, and he funneled the money into ventures that existed mostly on paper and mostly in his own pocket, a cotton speculation here, a mining claim there, each one collapsing quietly while he assured Adelaide, with that same warm, name-remembering charm, that the store was simply going through a difficult season and would right itself by spring. By the time Adelaide thought to pull her old hatbox down and compare her private notes against what Calloway was telling the bank, the debts had grown teeth, and the bank, which had been quietly courted by Calloway for over a year with promises of future business, was disinclined to hear an aging widow's suspicions over a respected young merchant's signature. The store closed within 18 months of Elias's death. The house followed 2 years after that, when Calloway, in a final act of audacity that still made Adelaide's hands tremble to recall it, personally arranged the foreclosure sale through a bank officer who owed him a favor, and stood at the edge of her own front yard during the auction, hat in hand, telling neighbors how very sorry he was to see it come to this, as though sorrow were a thing a man could borrow against his own theft. Her daughter Hester wrote from St. Louis begging her to come live with them, and Adelaide nearly went, except that something old and stubborn in her refused to leave Larkspur Hollow with her name dragged through it and nothing settled, refused to let the last chapter of her life be written by Royce Calloway's hand. So when the foreclosure notice came and the 9 days began ticking down, she did not pack a trunk for St. Louis. She walked, instead, down to the dead end of Mill Street, where the old depot sat behind a curtain of dead ivy and broken glass, and she asked old Sheriff Tate, who held the deed on behalf of the long-defunct railroad company, what he wanted for it, expecting to be laughed off the porch. He was not laughing when he named the price because $9 was, to every reasonable mind in Larkspur Hollow, an act of charity disguised as a sale, the depot being worth perhaps that much in salvage lumber and not 1 cent more. The building had stood empty since 1882, when the Wabash Line had rerouted 11 miles south to avoid a costly bridge crossing, taking with it every reason anyone had to step foot inside, and in the years since it had become a roost for barn owls and a dare for children and, more than once, a place where traveling men slept rough before moving on. Adelaide paid her $9 from the handkerchief that held the whole of her remaining fortune, and Sheriff Tate, not an unkind man, threw in the rusted key for free, telling her with genuine gentleness that she could always sell the lumber if she changed her mind, as though changing her mind were the only sensible direction left to travel in. She moved in that same week, sweeping out 2 decades of owl droppings and dead leaves from what had once been the small back room where the agent used to sleep between late trains, and she told herself, in the manner of people who have run out of softer lies, that at the very least it was a roof, and at the very least it was hers. It was on the 4th evening, while she was attempting to pry a swollen drawer free beneath the old ticket counter to use the space for her few remaining belongings, that her hand found a seam in the wall behind the ticket window that did not match the rest of the boards, a seam too straight, too deliberate, hidden behind a panel that had been painted over so many times it had nearly vanished into the wall itself. She worked it loose with the flat of a fire poker, her heart beating with the foolish, hopeful caution of a woman who has been disappointed too many times to trust hope outright, and when the panel finally gave way with a groan of old nails, she found, tucked into a shallow cavity built for exactly this purpose, a tin dispatch box, rusted at the corners but sealed tight, with a name stenciled faintly across its lid in railway paint, J. Jessup, Agent. She did not open it that first night, though every fiber of her wanted to, because something in the careful way it had been hidden told her this was not a thing to be rushed, and Adelaide had spent her whole life respecting the gravity of careful things. She set it on the ticket counter and looked at it the way her mother used to look at a column that didn't sit right, sensing, before she had any proof at all, that this box was the reason that seam had been so deliberately disguised, and that whoever Agent Jessup had been, he had not hidden it carelessly. When she finally worked the rusted clasp loose the following morning, with the gray light coming weak and clean through the cracked depot windows, she found inside a leather dispatch ledger, brittle but legible, and beneath it a bundle of personal letters tied with a ribbon long since faded to the color of old bone, and beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp mostly at bay, a small velvet pouch that, when she loosened its drawstring, spilled into her palm 7 gold coins and a folded scrap of paper that was not money at all, but a hand-drawn map. The ledger, written in a tight, careful hand, recorded freight and passenger manifests for the years 1878 through 1882, ordinary enough at a glance, except that Adelaide, with a lifetime of reading her mother's careful columns, noticed almost immediately that certain entries did not match the freight they claimed to describe, shipments of agricultural tools weighing far more than any plow ever forged, routed not to the farms they claimed but to a siding near an old mining camp that Adelaide remembered vaguely from childhood stories, a camp called Pitch Hollow that had closed under a cloud no one in town liked to discuss aloud. The letters told her why. They were written by the agent Josiah Jessup, to a woman named Margaret, evidently his wife, and they painted, slowly and in his own anguished words, a portrait of a man who had discovered that the depot's freight manifests were being used by the town's leading citizens of that era, men whose grandsons and great-nephews still sat on the Larkspur Hollow Town Council, to smuggle silver or quietly extracted from a vein on land that did not belong to them, land that, by treaty and by deed both, belonged to the Osage families who had been pressured and cheated out of their claims in the years after the war. Claims the mining men had simply continued working under the cover of agricultural shipments long after the official mine had been declared exhausted and closed to satisfy a federal inspector. Jessup wrote that he had tried twice to bring the matter to the territorial authorities, and that both times the matter had been quietly buried, the second time at the cost of his own position, for he had been dismissed from the railway under invented charges of drunkenness that Margaret's letters back to him, also preserved in the bundle, fiercely and lovingly denied. The final letter, dated only weeks before the depot would have closed its books for that season, was Jessup telling Margaret that he had hidden the ledger and the proof where no one would think to look, behind the very ticket window where he had spent his honest years, and that he intended to travel to Jefferson City himself to lay the matter before the governor's office, certain that this time, with the gold he had carefully saved from his own wages as security against retaliation, he would finally be believed. There was no further letter after that. Adelaide sat for a long while with the folded map in her lap, the one marking the location of the original or vein and the names, in Jessup's same careful hand, of the men who had profited from it, and understood that Josiah Jessup had likely never made it to Jefferson City at all, and that the silence which had swallowed him whole was the same silence that had swallowed every uncomfortable thing in Larkspur Hollow for 60 years. The names on that map were not strangers to her. Among them was Ambrose Calloway, founder of the very Calloway family that had produced Royce, and seeing it there, in faded ink decades older than her own grief, sent a current through Adelaide that was not quite triumph and not quite rage but something steadier and colder than either, a recognition that the rot in that family had not begun with Royce stealing her store, but had been planted 2 generations deep, in stolen or in a buried agent and a town that had decided, long before she was ever born, that comfortable silence was worth more than uncomfortable justice. She spent the following days moving carefully, because she understood now that she held something far larger than a vindication for herself. She held proof that could unmake reputations that Larkspur Hollow had spent 60 years polishing, and she knew enough about the town and about men like Royce Calloway to know that proof alone would not be enough, not against a council made up partly of Calloway's own allies and partly of men who had simply inherited the comfort of not asking questions. She brought the ledger first to the one person in town she trusted absolutely, a frail, sharp-eyed woman named Opal Whitfield who kept the general store's accounts and who had quietly for years done what Adelaide herself once did, watching the numbers that didn't sit right and saying nothing because no one had ever asked. Opal read the ledger by lamplight without speaking for nearly an hour, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, because her own grandmother had been one of the Osage women pushed off that very land, a fact the town had allowed itself to forget the way it forgot most things that made it uncomfortable, and Opal said only, "Well, Adelaide, what are we going to do about it?" Royce Calloway did not know at first what Adelaide had found, only that the woman he had ruined was suddenly, infuriatingly, not behaving like a ruined woman, walking through town with her chin level and her step unhurried, visiting the county recorder's office and the old church archive and, strangest of all, the small federal land office 2 towns over, where records of original Osage allotments were still kept in dusty, rarely consulted files. He sent word, through an intermediary, offering to settle what he called her unfortunate misunderstanding about the depot's condition, a thin attempt to buy her silence before he understood what, exactly, she might be silent about, and when Adelaide declined to even answer the note, his unease curdled quickly into the kind of aggression that men like Royce mistake for strength. He went to the town council, of which he was a comfortable and well-liked member, and proposed, with great civic concern, that the old depot be condemned as a public hazard, citing its age and its disrepair, a motion that would have evicted Adelaide from the only roof she had left within the month and conveniently buried, along with the building itself, whatever she might have found inside it. The council, populated by men who owed Calloway favors or simply liked his company at the tavern, seemed inclined to agree, and for one bitter evening Adelaide understood with total clarity what it felt like to watch a town's machinery turn quietly against you, polite and procedural and utterly without mercy. But Opal Whitfield, who had spent 40 years listening to every transaction and every rumor that passed through her store's front counter, knew exactly which council members had debts of their own, debts of conscience as much as commerce, and she spent that same evening visiting them one by one, not with threats, but with a single carefully chosen page copied from Jessup's ledger, enough to make each man wonder, quietly and alone in his own parlor, what else might be written in the rest of it, and whether his own grandfather's name might appear there too. The condemnation vote, when it came before the full council 2 weeks later, failed by a margin no one expected, and Royce Calloway, sensing the ground shifting beneath him though not yet understanding why, made his final and most desperate move. He went to Adelaide directly, alone, arriving at the depot at dusk with the same warm, name-remembering smile he had worn at her husband's funeral, and offered her, this time, an outright purchase of the depot at triple what she'd paid, framing it as generosity, as a kindness to a poor old widow who surely didn't want to spend her last years rattling around in a drafty old building. Adelaide listened to the whole of his offer without interrupting, the way her mother had taught her to let a man finish lying before you showed him you'd counted every false figure in his sum, and when he finished she set Jessup's ledger on the ticket counter between them, open to the page bearing his great-grandfather's name beside the silver tonnage routed through that very window, and she watched the warmth drain out of Royce Calloway's face the way water drains from a cracked basin, slow at first and then all at once. She told him, in a voice that did not rise and did not need to, that she had no intention of selling, and further, that she had no intention of using what she'd found to ruin him quietly in exchange for her own silence, because that, she said, was precisely the bargain his family had been making with this town for 60 years, and she would not become one more name added to that ledger of comfortable silences. What she intended to do, she told him, was the opposite of quiet. What Adelaide did next was not an act of vengeance, though every soul in Larkspur Hollow who watched it unfold understood that justice and vengeance can sometimes walk the same road for a while before they part ways. She did not take Jessup's findings to a newspaper eager for scandal, nor did she use them merely to recover her own house and store, though both of those things eventually came to pass through entirely lawful and rather satisfying channels once the county prosecutor reviewed the ledger and the matching land office records and found Royce's foreclosure built on the same family foundation of quiet theft his ancestors had perfected. Instead, she called a public meeting at the one building in town large enough to hold it, the depot itself, which she had spent the preceding weeks restoring with borrowed tools and willing hands, Opal's chief among them, scrubbing the old ticket window until its brass shone and patching the roof with lumber she'd once been told to sell off as scrap. She stood behind that same ticket window, where Josiah Jessup had once stood and Josiah Jessup had once disappeared, and she read his letters aloud to a town that had spent 60 years not asking what happened to him, and she laid out, plainly and without theatrics, exactly whose silver had paid for exactly which fine houses on Larkspur Hollow's better streets, and exactly whose land it had been stolen from. She did not call for those families to be punished in any way the law could not already handle on its own slow terms. What she asked for instead, surprised a town that had braced itself for a reckoning of fire, was restoration. She proposed that the depot itself, restored, become a public archive and meeting hall, a place where the Osage families whose names still appeared in the old allotment records, several of whom, including Opal's own cousins, still lived within writing distance, could formally pursue the federal claims that Jessup's evidence now made unignorable, and she proposed that a portion of whatever restitution the courts eventually ordered be set aside not for herself, but for a town fund to maintain the depot as exactly what it had once been meant to be, the honest, careful chamber through which the whole community's life and goods and stories could move again, the way her father had once shown her it should. The Federal Land Office, presented with Jessup's original allotment map and ledger alongside corroborating county records that Opal helped Adelaide track down, did move, slowly and imperfectly the way such offices always do, but it moved, and within 2 years a meaningful settlement was reached with the descendants of the Osage families whose land had been worked without consent, a settlement that could never undo 60 years, but which Opal's cousin, an elder named Walks with Thunder Whitehorn, said quietly to Adelaide was more than silence ever gave us, which Adelaide came to understand was perhaps the most honest definition of justice available to anyone living in an imperfect world trying its best to become slightly less imperfect. Royce Calloway's foreclosure of Adelaide's home, built as it was on documents his bank ally had improperly notarized, was overturned by the county court that same year, and her house and what remained recoverable of Elias's store were restored to her name, though by then Adelaide found she wanted the house far less than she'd expected to, having grown, in her months of dust and lamplight and careful discovery, rather attached to the small back room of the depot where Josiah Jessup himself had once slept between late trains. Royce did not go to prison, for the specific frauds against Adelaide fell, in the end, into the gray and frustrating territory the law reserves for men with good lawyers and respectable last names, but he lost his seat on the council within the year, lost the contracts that had sustained his comfortable life, and lost, most visibly and most permanently, the easy warmth of a town that had once let him remember their names back to them like a gift, and now crossed the street rather than let him try. And so it was that the whole town which had once called Adelaide Marsh a foolish old woman for spending her last $9 on a tomb of splinters came, in time, to understand what she had understood from the very first evening she pried that crooked panel loose behind the ticket window, that the things a community discards as worthless are very often simply the things it has not yet taken the trouble to look at closely, and that history does not truly vanish when it is buried, it only waits, patient as rust, for someone careful enough to come looking. Adelaide Marsh had lost a husband, a son, a store, and a house to forces that believed an aging widow's quiet carefulness made her easy to overlook, and it was that very carefulness, the same careful eye her mother had given her over a kitchen ledger 60 years before, that let her see what an entire town had walked past for over a decade without ever once wondering why an old depot's ticket window had a seam that didn't quite match. She had bought, for the price of a handkerchief's worth of coins, not a ruin, but a chamber that history had been waiting in, patiently, for the one person willing to listen to it. Before we close the depot doors on this story, we want to thank you for spending this quiet hour with Adelaide and Josiah and the slow, stubborn unburying of Larkspur Hollow's true ledger, and if her story moved something in you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who still believes that overlooked things can hold the most worth. We'd love to know in the comments below. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off as worthless? We read every one of them, and we read them slowly, the way Adelaide read an old ledger by lamplight. Until next time, stay close.